Vivid verses.
I've always been the kind of person who notices things, not in a paranoid way. I want to be clear about that. It's not some anxious habit I developed from a difficult childhood or a string of bad experiences. It's more like a baseline setting. The way a musician instinctively tracks rhythm in a crowded room, or the way a structural engineer glances at a building and sees load-bearing logic before he sees architecture. I notice things because my mind is built that way, and years of work as a systems analyst at Vortec Consulting have only sharpened the tendency into something close to a reflex. I notice when the spacing in a spreadsheet is off by 2 decimal places. I notice when a client's financial projections use different base assumptions in alternating quarters. I notice when a colleague says, "We completed the audit on a Tuesday, but the access logs show the audit folder was open for the first time on Thursday." Details are data. Data tells stories. That's the job. My name is Callum Reed, and on the 14th of March, I walked into a wine bar called Cellar 42 on Brindlewood Avenue to meet my friend Patrick for a drink, and ended up staying for 3 hours because the woman at the adjacent table kept laughing at something her friend said, and her laugh was the most unapologetic thing I'd heard in years. It wasn't performative. It wasn't contained. It just came out of her the way sound comes out of an instrument, because that's what instruments do. Her name was Iris Vane. She was 28 to my 32, worked as a freelance brand consultant, had strong opinions about espresso, and equally strong opinions about people who had no opinions at all. We started talking when Patrick excused himself to take a phone call and never came back, a fact I didn't hold against him, since his departure created the specific geometry of the conversation that followed. By the time Iris and I exchanged numbers, I had already noted she was direct. She remembered details mid-conversation and wove them back in. She held eye contact without aggression, and she picked up the social cues I dropped the way someone catches a ball thrown at a reasonable speed, naturally, without making a show of it. I liked her. We dated for 2 months before I could say I was genuinely invested. By month 3, I was comfortable. By month 4, I was happy in the uncomplicated way that feels almost suspicious when you're used to building careful models of everything. She fit. That was the simplest way to describe it. Iris fit into my life the way a variable fits cleanly into an equation, not forcing anything out of place, just making the whole structure more elegant, which made what came next harder to process. It started in month 5. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the first moment with precision, a Saturday afternoon at the Fenwick Farmers Market on Colton Street. We've been going there almost every weekend since February. It was one of those routines that builds itself without either person formally suggesting it. We'd split up at the entrance, each take a half of the market, and meet at the Hazelbrook coffee stall at the far end. Iris always got there first because she moved faster and bought less. Except that Saturday, she was already at the Hazelbrook stall when I arrived, which was normal. What wasn't normal was that she didn't have her usual order, an oat flat white in the red paper cup they use for the medium size. She had a large black coffee, no milk. "Since when do you drink it black?" I asked. She looked at the cup for a moment, just a fraction of a second too long. "I felt like something different," she said. "I didn't make anything of it. People feel like something different. That's not a data point. That's a Saturday." But I filed it. The next instance came about 11 days later. We were at a dinner party at our mutual friend Danny's apartment on the 3rd floor of a building called the Ashworth on Vickers Lane. 6 of us around a table, good wine, Danny's famously ambitious lamb dish that took 4 hours to cook and about 20 minutes to disappear. Halfway through the evening, someone brought up a documentary about deep-sea ecosystems that Iris and I had watched together the previous month. She'd been fascinated by it, had spent the better part of the drive home talking about bioluminescence, about how creatures at depth had evolved to produce their own light because the sun couldn't reach them. At Danny's table, when Patrick mentioned it, Iris said she hadn't seen it. You watched it with Callum, Patrick said, looking at me for confirmation. I think I fell asleep, Iris said, and laughed, and moved the conversation forward. I confirmed for Patrick that yes, we'd watched it, and then I let it go. But I noticed, people misremember. They say they fell asleep because it's easier than explaining they weren't paying attention, or because they've half forgotten something in the blur of a busy month. That's normal. What I noticed wasn't the misremembering. It was the speed of the pivot. She hadn't hesitated to collect the memory and then discard it. She produced the exit strategy, fell asleep, in a way that read less like embarrassment and more like redirection. Still, one data point isn't a trend. I kept living my life. Over the next 6 weeks, I accumulated more. Iris, the Iris I knew, had a specific relationship with music. She listened to everything, but had a deep, slightly defensive love of 90s Britpop. She could recite pulp lyrics the way some people recite poetry. She told me the story of how her older cousin played different class in the car when she was 9, and it rewired something in her permanently. And she told it with the specific warmth that real origin stories carry. On a Wednesday evening at her apartment, I put on an Oasis record while I made dinner. She said, I actually don't really like Oasis. I turned around. She was looking at her phone. Since when? I just think they're overrated. I stood there for a moment. I didn't say anything else because I was genuinely recalibrating. She had referenced Oasis specifically and fondly in 3 separate conversations. I remembered one clearly because she'd argued that Definitely Maybe was a better record than Morning Glory, and I'd agreed, and we'd spent 20 minutes on it. I didn't press. I noted. Then came the afternoon. I arrived at her apartment unannounced. Something she'd explicitly said was fine, had in fact encouraged early in the relationship by saying she found it romantic when someone showed up instead of texting. I had her spare key. I knocked and then let myself in because her phone was going to voicemail and I had a book she'd lent me. She was in the kitchen. She turned when she heard me come in, and for just a moment, a beat, maybe half a second, there was a look on her face that I could only describe as caught. Not the pleasant surprise of someone whose partner has appeared unexpectedly. The specific micro-expression of someone processing an intrusion. Then it smoothed, and she smiled, and she said she was glad I'd come by. But I was already calculating. I want to be honest about my process here. I didn't become obsessive. I didn't install anything on her phone or follow her or behave in any way that I'd need to justify. What I did was what I do with every system that starts producing irregular outputs. I started paying closer attention to the original baseline. I went back through everything I knew about Iris, not from a suspicious angle, but from a structural one. Who was she? Demonstrably, from documented experience. What were her consistent patterns? She always sat on the left side of a restaurant booth. Not a preference she'd ever articulated. Just something she consistently did. She had a small scar beneath her right ear from a childhood bicycle incident she'd mentioned on our 3rd date. She was left-handed, but she used her phone with her right. She had a specific way of laughing at herself. A brief exhale through the nose followed by the actual laugh. A double beat that was distinctive once you knew to listen for it. She ordered sparkling water, not still. She took her coffee with oat milk. She knew the documentary. She liked Oasis. She'd seen that film at the Van Cinema on Orchard Road twice because she'd loved it the first time. I started testing softly. Not entrapments, just gentle references. I'd bring up something I knew the real Iris would recognize, the documentary, the music, a specific conversation we'd had, and watch for the response. What I found over the following weeks was a pattern that was more disturbing than simple inconsistency. On some days, she was completely herself. She caught every reference. She laughed the double beat laugh. She sat left side, sparkling water, oat milk, all of it. On other days, She was almost herself. 95%. The scar was there. The face was the same. The voice was the same. But the references missed. The coffee was wrong. The knowledge had gaps. I ran a pattern. I built a mental timeline. The mismatches didn't correlate with her mood, her stress levels, her work schedule, or anything environmental that I could identify. They were distributed somewhat randomly across weeks and social contexts. The wrongness wasn't escalating in the way you'd expect if she were drifting from me emotionally. It was intermittent, periodic. The word that kept surfacing when I let my mind settle on it was substitution. I didn't let myself run with that thought immediately. I held it at a distance and examined it from every other angle first, because I'm not someone who leaps to the dramatic conclusion before exhausting the mundane ones. Could this be dissociation? Stress-related memory lapses? Something medical? I considered all of it, but the pattern didn't fit any of those frameworks. Dissociation doesn't selectively remove your knowledge of your favorite music while leaving everything else intact. Substitution. The question was, what was being substituted and why? I'm not a private investigator. I'm a systems analyst. The difference matters because a private investigator collects evidence. What I do is interrogate structure. I don't need to catch someone in an act. I need to find the architecture. I started with what I had. Iris's public social media was light. She kept most things private, which I'd always respected and never questioned. But I spent an evening going back through the posts she had made publicly over the years, looking not at the content, but at the metadata patterns. Post times, location tags, commenting behaviors. I found something. Over a period going back approximately 4 years, there were 2 distinct clusters of social activity that never quite overlapped in real time. Not dramatically, not separated by continents or time zones, but there were occasional same-day posts that would have required her to be in 2 places simultaneously. A tag photo at a rooftop event on Clement Terrace on a Saturday evening, and a comment she'd posted at almost the exact same time on someone else's photo, a comment that contained a specific geolocation reference to a neighborhood on the other side of the city. People make mistakes with post timing. They schedule things. They tag late. But I also noticed that the profile photo had changed twice over those 4 years in a way that didn't match a linear aging pattern. The second version was subtly different. Not older, but different. Slightly different jaw angle. Marginally different ear shape. The kind of difference you wouldn't catch unless you were putting photographs side by side, and you happen to have spent a significant amount of time looking at the person's face. I put the photographs side by side. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went to see Patrick. Patrick Osei is the kind of friend who tells you the truth even when it costs him the easier version of the evening. We've been friends since university. He knew Iris moderately well enough to have an outside perspective on her. Over drinks at the Lantern and Latch Pub on Grieve Street, I laid out the inconsistencies without offering him my conclusion. I wanted his uncontaminated assessment. He listened. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, there was a thing at Danny's last month. Tell me. Iris, I thought it was Iris, was talking to me about something before you arrived. I mentioned that thing she'd said at your birthday dinner in November. The thing about her parents' house. He paused, and she looked at me like I was speaking a different language. What kind of look? Not confused. Just blank for a second. Like she was deciding whether to ask me what I was talking about, or just agree. He picked up his glass. She agreed. I figured she'd had a couple of drinks. I nodded. She doesn't drink much. No, Patrick said. She doesn't. We sat with that. I didn't tell him what I was thinking, but I left the Lantern and Latch with the architecture in place. Armed with a working theory, I didn't move immediately. I kept showing up. I kept being present in the relationship. But now I was watching with calibrated attention rather than the comfortable inattention of someone who trusts what he sees. The final 6 weeks were the clearest period of documentation I could have asked for. I established a simple test. There was a specific story about Iris's grandmother, told to me in our second month, in detail, with the kind of emotional texture that only comes from something genuinely remembered. Her grandmother had kept a garden of herbs in clay pots on a window ledge in a council flat, and had given each pot a name. Iris had recounted 3 of the names. She had laughed at one of them. I worked the grandmother story into conversation twice in that final month. The first time, a Sunday lunch at a restaurant called the Barley Croft on Penfield Row. She completed the story before I'd even finished prompting it. Named all 3 pots. Laughed at the right one. That was Iris. The real one. The second time, a Wednesday evening on her sofa, I began the same prompt and watched a different result unfold. She nodded at a general level. She offered a vague affirmation. She did not name the pots. I kept my face neutral. I asked a soft follow-up question. She answered it with a confidence that would have read as authentic to anyone who hadn't heard the original answer. But the answer was wrong in 3 specific details. I said nothing. I filed it. I built the case to completion. By the time I ended the relationship, I had documented 11 clear instances across 8 weeks. The pattern was unambiguous. 2 people, identical or near identical in appearance, alternating time with me according to a schedule I wasn't privy to. The variations weren't random. They were the gaps between what one person knew and what the other had been briefed on. And briefing is imperfect. Briefing always leaves seams. What I didn't know was why. I had theories. None of them were flattering. None of them were accidental. I ended it on a Thursday evening. Not impulsively. Not with accumulated frustration finally boiling over. I chose a Thursday because it was a low-stakes day for her. No big meetings, no social commitments I'd have to feel guilty about disrupting. I went to her apartment at 7, having texted an hour before that I wanted to talk. She replied quickly. That was consistent with Iris. When she opened the door, I ran my check in the first 2 seconds. Left hand dominant on the door handle. Small scar present. I offered a casual opening line that referenced something only the real Iris would have tracked without effort. She tracked it. So, the real one. Fine. Better, actually. I would rather say this once to the person who'd actually built the relationship than once to the stand-in. We sat in her living room. She made tea, oat milk, correct, and she sat across from me with the expression of someone who had already read the weather. She could tell. Good. That made it faster. I've been doing a lot of thinking, I said, about us, about the last few months. Okay, she said. Quiet. Careful. I'm going to be direct, because that's the only way I know how to do this. Something has been off for a while, and I don't mean your moods or the random inconsistencies in conversations. I mean something structural, something that doesn't fit any of the explanations I normally reach for. She held my gaze. I gave her credit for that. I've been with you long enough to know you pretty well, I continued. And over the last few months, I've noticed things that I can't explain by variance in mood or memory. Things that point towards something more specific. I kept my voice even. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been theatrical, and I don't do theatrical. I think this relationship has run its course. I think whoever you are on any given day, and I mean that more literally than it might sound right now, this isn't working anymore. She put her mug down. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. More like a calculation expiring. Callum, she said, and then she stopped. You don't need to explain, I said. I'm not here for the explanation. I'm here to end it clearly and without drama. There was a long pause. Then she said, I have a twin sister. I'll let that land. An identical twin, she continued, and her voice had changed. Less composed now, more honest, which I appreciated even as I processed what was being admitted. Her name is Vera. We've been doing this since we were teenagers. It started as a game. We'd switch, see if people could tell. I didn't say anything yet. With you, it became a test. She looked at her hands. I want to know if you could tell us apart. If you were actually paying attention. If you actually knew me. I sat with that for exactly as long as it deserved. Then I said, so you're telling me that you and another person took turns being present in our relationship without my knowledge. And the purpose of that was to see whether I'd notice the difference. It was meant to, and that the mood swings I experienced, the inconsistencies in conversation, the memory gaps, the behavior changes, all of that was the natural consequence of two different people operating under one identity inside a relationship I was investing in. She didn't answer. The silence was confirmation enough. I want to make sure I understand the full picture, I said, because the version you're presenting is that this was a test of my attentiveness, of whether I cared enough to know you. I paused. But the actual structure of what you're describing is that you and your sister collaborated to systematically create confusion about your identity over a period of months in a relationship with a person who had no knowledge or consent. Callum, that's gaslighting, I said, not as a rhetorical accusation, as a functional description of what occurred. I began doubting my own perceptions. I spent time questioning whether I was being unreasonable, whether my memory was faulty, whether I was imagining inconsistencies. Those are the effects of gaslighting. The mechanism behind it doesn't change the outcome. She looked stricken, genuinely, I thought, which meant she hadn't fully mapped the shape of what she'd built until I'd outlined it for her. People often don't. They're inside the thing looking outward, and the silhouette isn't visible from the inside. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said. I know that sounds. I believe you weren't trying to hurt me, I said. But I need you to understand that trying and doing are different columns in the same spreadsheet. I stood. You designed a system. The system had predictable outputs. You ran it for months. Whatever the intent was, the result was a sustained collaborative deception that I was living inside without knowing it. She stood too. If you'd figured it out sooner. I did figure it out, I said. I've known the architecture for a while. I'm leaving now because I finished the case, not because you just told me. That landed. I picked up my jacket from the arm of the chair. I moved toward the door. She followed. I'm sorry, she said at the door. And she meant it. I could hear it. Real remorse has a specific acoustic quality that performed remorse doesn't manage. I turned back. I believe that, I said. And I want to be clear, I don't leave this angry. I'm not going to spend energy being furious. What I am is certain. I held her gaze for one final beat. I knew you and another person collaborated to gaslight me. That's actually more disturbing than mood swings. Good riddance to both of you. I said it without venom, just as the accurate conclusion of an accurate analysis. I walked down the corridor, took the lift to the ground floor, and stepped out through the glass doors of her building into the cool Thursday night air. Patrick called on Saturday. He'd heard from Danny, who'd heard from Iris. That's how social networks function. Information propagates along the path of least resistance and arrives slightly garbled at the destination. She told Danny there was a family thing, Patrick said, that you and she had a falling out over something personal. That's accurate, I said. I was at my kitchen counter making coffee. Single origin, properly weighed. The small rituals of an ordered life. Are you all right? Yes, I said. Not as a deflection. Genuinely. That's it? Just yes. I spent months building a picture I didn't fully understand yet. Now I understand it. The not understanding part was the difficult part. Understanding it is just resolution. Patrick was quiet for a second. Then what was it? What actually happened? I told him. I kept it concise. He processed it with the silence of someone encountering an architecture they hadn't expected. She tested you, he said finally. That's what she called it. And you think it was more than that. I think the name you give something doesn't change what it is, I said. A test requires transparency after the fact to have integrity. If you run a test and never intend to reveal it, that's not a test. That's just surveillance. Patrick exhaled. I remember that blank look now. At Danny's. That was her sister. Almost certainly. How are you really feeling, Cal? I considered the question, not to produce a better answer, but because Patrick deserved a real one. I feel clear, I said. I feel like I spent months in a building where the floor plan kept changing and someone finally handed me the blueprint. The blueprint is awful, but at least I know where the walls are. He seemed to accept that. We talked for a while about other things, work, a cricket match he'd been to, the renovation Patrick was starting on his flat in Devlin Square. The normal weight of an ordinary Saturday conversation. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a few minutes. The thing about working with systems for a living is that you develop a healthy respect for complexity and a healthy skepticism of chaos. Most things that look like chaos aren't. Most irregularities have root causes. The question is always whether you're willing to do the work of tracing them back. I had done the work. What I found at the root hadn't been malice. Iris, the real Iris, wasn't a fundamentally cruel person. I could hold both things at once. She had genuinely cared about me, and she had done something that caused genuine harm. Those two facts weren't contradictory. They were just the full, unsimplified picture. What she hadn't accounted for, what people who run tests usually don't account for, is that you can't design a test for someone's love without altering the thing you're trying to measure. The act of testing changes the conditions. You introduce variables you can't control, and when the results come back, you can't separate what you caused from what you found. She wanted to know if I really knew her. The answer was yes. I had known her from the second month. I had tracked her patterns the way I track every system I care about. Not obsessively, not territorially, but with the natural attentiveness of someone who is genuinely paying attention. What she hadn't asked, and couldn't have known to ask, was whether knowing her was enough if the thing I thought I knew turned out to have a second version running in parallel. It wasn't. I went back to Cellar 42 on a Friday evening. Not for sentiment. Danny had organized a small dinner for 6 of us. A birthday for a colleague of hers I'd met twice and liked, and Cellar 42 happened to be the venue. I arrived first, found the table, ordered sparkling water, and watched the room. It was the same place. Good light, bottles arranged on open shelving behind the bar, the low hum of people in good moods, choosing to be somewhere pleasant on a Friday. Patrick arrived next, then Danny, then the birthday colleague whose name was Renata, then 2 others I knew by face and occasional conversation. We ordered. We talked. The evening had the easy momentum that good dinners have when no one is performing and the food is decent and no one is checking their phone more than once every 30 minutes. About halfway through, a woman at the adjacent table laughed at something. It was a real laugh, not contained, not curated. It just arrived. I didn't feel anything elegiac about it. I didn't think of Iris. I just thought, that's what honest sounds like. Patrick caught my eye across the table. He raised his glass. I raised mine. Renata was asking Danny something about a market she'd read about. A new one opening on the north side, Harlow Street, artisan food vendors, the usual. Danny was enthusiastic. The conversation moved on. I ate well and talked when I had something worth saying and listened when other people did. On the walk home along Canfield Row, the air was cold and clear and the streetlights were doing their job, throwing overlapping pools of yellow across the pavement. A decent city on a decent night. I thought about systems. I thought about the difference between complexity and disorder. A complex system can still be coherent. It follows rules, even if those rules are layered and non-obvious. A disordered system just generates noise. What I've been living inside for those months was disorder pretending to be complexity. A system wearing the costume of something that made sense. The moment you strip the costume off, the noise resolves. What you're left with is just the clear decision that was always going to be the correct one. I turned up my collar against the cold. I walked home.
Thanks for listening.